everyone, I hope that you are doing fine this 2026. For decades, the United States has used travel bans as a political weapon, deciding who is welcome and who is not, especially targeting the Africans and the Muslim majority nations. When Donald Trump introduced his travel ban, it sent a clear message. Some countries and their people were considered undesirable. Now, something historic is taking place. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are responding by banning U.S. citizens. This is not random. It is retaliation. It is a political statement. And more importantly, Africa is saying, if you can close the doors for us, we can as well close the doors for you. These countries are no longer interested in symbolic diplomacy. They are led by governments that openly reject Western pressure. They reject the Western lectures and Western double standards. To them, Trump's travel ban was not about security, it was about disrespect. Welcome back to Polito Realities, a channel that digs deep and finds out what so many people fear to talk about. If you love listening to true discussions, then remember that this is the right place for you. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to share today's video.
Tit for tat diplomacy. Africa pushes back as Mali and Burkina Faso bar U.S. travelers. Good evening, and welcome to BAV Africa Now, Weekly Digest. I'm Amy Callan, and tonight we turn our focus to a fast-developing diplomatic standoff that is quietly reshaping Africa-U.S. relations, exposing deeper questions about sovereignty, security, and Africa's evolving place in a multipolar world. This week, Mali and Burkina Faso announced that they will bar U.S. citizens from entering their countries. The move is explicitly described as reciprocal, a tit-for-tat response to sweeping travel restrictions imposed by the United States under President Donald Trump.
Mali and Burkina Faso have announced travel restrictions on American citizens after the US added both countries to a no-entry list. Both members of the Alliance of Sahel states, the two nations say they're imposing equivalent measures with immediate effect. In Mali, it's a move that appears to have the backing of its citizens. America is a country in the world, just like Mali. In this world, respect must be enforced. America has asserted its country's rules. We have also made our principles known. We can no longer allow any country, whether it be a superpower or a third country, to disrespect us. Respect is mutual. I thank all the people of the AES. We will no longer yield to anyone. We have taken a path of no return. From now on, we would rather die than give in. Neither the United States nor France will be able to make us bend. Citizens of nearly 40 countries now face restrictions visiting America solely by virtue of nationality. The list includes Niger, Sierra Leone, and South Sudan. It's a diplomatic struggle. Often it ends in a standoff. They have shown their power. It's up to us to defend our dignity and patriotism, and that's perfectly normal. Mali voiced its regret that the US had made such an important decision without the slightest prior consultation.
Let us be clear about what is unfolding here. This is not a routine visa dispute. It is a symbolic and political escalation that reflects a much broader recalibration of power, alliances, and identity across parts of Africa, particularly in the Sahel. The immediate trigger: U.S. travel restrictions. Earlier this month, the White House confirmed that full entry restrictions would be imposed on citizens from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, alongside South Sudan, Syria, and Palestinian Authority passport holders. The policy is set to take effect on 1 January, with the administration citing U.S. national security concerns. According to the White House, the restrictions will remain until affected countries demonstrate credible improvements in identity management, data sharing, and cooperation with U.S. immigration authorities. While exemptions exist, covering lawful permanent residents, diplomats, certain visa holders, and athletes, this remains one of the most expansive U.S. travel bans in recent years. Notably, Sierra Leone and Laos were also elevated from partial to full restrictions, while partial limits were placed on 15 additional countries, including Nigeria, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Africa's response: reciprocity and sovereign equality. Burkina Faso's Foreign Affairs Minister, Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, framed his country's response as grounded in the principle of reciprocity. Mali's foreign ministry went further, explicitly invoking sovereign equality and mutual respect, while criticizing Washington for making such a consequential decision without prior consultation. This language matters. It signals a shift from quiet diplomatic grievance to open assertion of state dignity, especially among governments that already see Western engagement as selective, punitive, and politically motivated. Although Niger has not yet issued a formal diplomatic statement, its state media reports that Niamey has adopted a similar ban on U.S. citizens. If confirmed, that would complete a coordinated response among the 3 Sahelian states now governed by military juntas following coups. Africa-wide comparison. Not all bans are treated equally. Here is where the Africa-wide lens becomes essential. Countries such as Nigeria and Tanzania, civilian-ruled U.S. security partners and contributors to peacekeeping, received partial restrictions rather than full bans. Meanwhile, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger face the harshest treatment. This creates a two-tier Africa policy. Engaged partners are pressured but accommodated. Defiant or non-aligned states are isolated. From an African perspective, this reinforces a long-standing criticism that security cooperation, governance style, and geopolitical alignment, not just technical passport systems, shape Western immigration decisions. The Sahel pivot: Russia, regional blocs, and strategic autonomy. All 3 countries are now members of a newly formed regional alliance outside the traditional ECOWAS framework. They have expelled French forces, reduced Western military cooperation, and deepened ties with Russia, both politically and militarily. In this context, the U.S. travel ban is not interpreted locally as a neutral security measure, but as political punishment for choosing an alternative geopolitical path. Across Africa, this resonates. From Central Africa to parts of the Horn, governments are closely watching whether asserting strategic autonomy invites isolation or leverage. Forward-looking analysis. Where does this lead? If this diplomatic standoff continues, 3 trajectories emerge. First, people-to-people ties suffer most. Students, entrepreneurs, civil society actors, and diaspora families will pay the highest price on both sides, despite having little influence over state policy. Second, Africa-U.S. relations risk fragmenting further. Washington's reliance on migration controls and travel bans as leverage may deepen skepticism among African publics, even in countries not directly targeted. Third, this moment accelerates Africa's multipolar drift. As Western access narrows, Sahelian states will likely deepen non-Western partnerships, not only with Russia, but also with Middle Eastern and Asian actors willing to engage without political conditionalities. The unresolved question is whether the United States recalibrates, choosing engagement over exclusion, or doubles down on pressure in hopes of forcing compliance. And as this unfolds, one must ask, are travel bans becoming the new front line of geopolitical competition, replacing dialogue with deterrence? And if so, what does that mean for Africa's long-term diplomatic leverage, for regional stability in the Sahel, and for ordinary citizens caught between sovereignty claims and security politics? And when we talk about immigration policy as a tool of power projection, we are really talking about who gets mobility in the global system and who does not. For decades, African countries have argued that visa regimes imposed by Western states operate less as neutral security filters and more as political signaling mechanisms. The latest U.S. decision reinforces that belief, particularly because it comes at a time when Sahelian states are openly challenging Western influence and redefining their security partnerships. According to the White House, the benchmark for lifting restrictions hinges on credible improvements in identity management and information sharing. Yet African diplomats privately question why similar standards are not uniformly applied to non-African states with comparable, or worse, documentation and data sharing challenges. This inconsistency is one reason Mali's foreign ministry emphasized sovereign equality in its response. From Bamako to Ouagadougou, the message is simple. If borders are weaponized against us, we will respond in kind. A broader African pattern: visas, power, and perception. Across the continent, travel restrictions have increasingly become a barometer of diplomatic standing. Countries perceived as cooperative receive waivers, partial exemptions, or quiet technical support. Those perceived as resistant face public bans. Take Nigeria, Africa's largest economy and a key U.S. security partner. Despite persistent issues with overstays and documentation flagged in past U.S. reports, Nigeria was placed under partial, not full, restrictions. Meanwhile, Mali and Burkina Faso, countries that have expelled Western troops and rejected Western political frameworks, were placed under the strictest category. This divergence underscores a reality many African analysts now openly state: immigration policy is foreign policy by other means. The Sahelian response: symbolism over numbers. Critics may argue that banning U.S. citizens from Mali or Burkina Faso is largely symbolic, given relatively low American travel volumes. But symbolism matters in diplomacy, especially for governments seeking domestic legitimacy. The military-led governments in Mali and Burkina Faso have framed their rule around narratives of dignity, independence, and resistance to external domination. Standing up to Washington, even symbolically, reinforces that narrative at home. It also sends a message to other African states. Reciprocity is no longer taboo. Niger's quiet alignment and regional coordination. Although Niger has yet to issue a formal diplomatic communique, reports from its state broadcaster indicate a similar ban on U.S. citizens. If officially confirmed, this would mark a coordinated Sahelian position rather than isolated national responses. That coordination is significant. These three countries have already withdrawn from ECOWAS and established their own regional bloc, signaling a willingness to absorb diplomatic and economic costs in exchange for strategic autonomy. In effect, the travel ban dispute is becoming a test case. Can African states act collectively when challenged by major powers? The Russia factor and beyond. Western officials often frame Sahelian realignment as a simple pivot toward Moscow. But that analysis is incomplete. What we are seeing is not just a Russia pivot. It is a post-Western diversification strategy. From defense cooperation to mining concessions and infrastructure financing, Sahelian governments are exploring partnerships with Russia, Turkey, Gulf states, and parts of Asia. The U.S. travel ban may unintentionally accelerate this trend by hardening perceptions that engagement with Washington comes primarily through pressure rather than partnership. And this matters continent-wide. Countries watching from Central and Southern Africa are quietly asking whether non-alignment or selective alignment now carries fewer costs than before. Implications for diasporas and soft power. One of the least discussed consequences of the ban is its impact on African diasporas. Students, academics, entrepreneurs, and families, become collateral damage in what is essentially a geopolitical contest. Soft power, long a strength of the United States in Africa, relies on openness, exchange, and aspiration. Travel bans erode that reservoir of goodwill. And once lost, soft power is far harder to rebuild than military alliances. What comes next? The critical question is whether this dispute hardens into a long-term diplomatic freeze or opens the door to renegotiation. African diplomats suggest that behind closed doors, there is still room for technical engagement on passport security, data systems, and migration cooperation. But public pressure, especially from Sahelian governments that have staked their legitimacy on defiance, makes quiet compromise politically costly. So we are left at a crossroads. Does Washington recalibrate its Africa policy to reflect a changing geopolitical reality? Or does it continue to rely on exclusionary tools that may yield compliance but deepen resentment? And just as importantly, will other African states adopt reciprocity as a standard response, transforming what was once a unilateral Western instrument into a contested diplomatic arena? Because the next phase of this story will determine whether travel bans remain administrative measures or evolve into one of the defining fault lines of Africa-West relations in the years ahead. And this is where the conversation widens beyond visas and borders into the architecture of global governance itself. For years, African leaders have complained, often quietly, sometimes publicly, that decisions affecting their citizens are taken in distant capitals with minimal consultation. Mali's foreign ministry made this explicit, lamenting that the U.S. decision was reached without any prior consultation. That statement is not just diplomatic frustration, it reflects a deeper grievance about voice and agency in international decision-making. When policies framed as security measures disproportionately affect African states, they feed a perception that Africa remains an object of policy, not a partner in shaping it. ECOWAS, fragmentation, and a changing regional order. Traditionally, disputes of this nature would have been mediated through ECOWAS, leveraging regional diplomacy to soften bilateral tensions. But Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are no longer operating within that framework. Their withdrawal from ECOWAS and the creation of an alternative Sahelian alliance means there is now no established regional buffer between them and global powers like the United States. Every dispute becomes direct, bilateral, and potentially escalatory. This fragmentation has implications far beyond the Sahel. Other African regions are watching closely, asking whether regional blocs still serve as shields, or whether national sovereignty, asserted forcefully, is becoming the preferred currency. Security narratives versus African realities. From Washington's perspective, the travel ban is rooted in risk management, concerns about identity verification, overstays, and information sharing. But from an African perspective, this logic feels selectively applied. Several African security analysts point out that instability in the Sahel, often cited as justification for restrictions, has been shaped in part by years of external military interventions, failed counterterrorism strategies, and underinvestment in civilian governance. In other words, Africa is being restricted for crises it did not create alone. This is why the rhetoric coming out of Bamako and Ouagadougou resonates across the continent. The insistence on sovereign equality taps into a shared African memory of decisions imposed rather than negotiated. The risk of normalizing retaliatory diplomacy. Yet there is also a risk here, for Africa. If reciprocity becomes the default response to travel restrictions, diplomacy may slide into a cycle of symbolic retaliation that hardens positions without resolving underlying issues. Travel bans are blunt instruments. They rarely fix technical deficiencies, but they excel at inflaming national pride. Some African policy thinkers warn that this approach could limit Africa's own diplomatic flexibility, especially for countries that rely heavily on educational exchanges, remittances, and diaspora engagement. So the challenge becomes balance, asserting dignity without foreclosing dialogue. A continental inflection point. What we are witnessing may well be an inflection point in Africa's engagement with Western powers. In the past, similar bans were often met with muted responses. This time, the reaction is public, coordinated, and unapologetic. That signals growing confidence, especially among governments that feel insulated from Western leverage due to alternative partnerships. But confidence does not equal immunity. Economic exposure, aid flows, development finance, and international legitimacy still matter. The real test will be whether Sahelian states can convert symbolic defiance into tangible gains for their populations. Questions that will shape the next phase. So, as this story continues to unfold, several critical questions remain unresolved. Will the United States open technical channels to de-escalate, or will security benchmarks be enforced without political flexibility? Will other African states quietly support the Sahelian stance, or distance themselves to avoid similar scrutiny? And most importantly, will ordinary Africans benefit from this assertive posture? Or will mobility, education, and opportunity become further constrained in an already unequal global system? These are not abstract questions. They go to the heart of Africa's future relationship with global power, whether it is shaped by negotiation or confrontation, inclusion or exclusion. And as governments trade bans and statements, the deeper struggle over respect, recognition, and relevance continues, quietly redefining what sovereignty means for Africa in a world that is no longer unipolar but not yet truly equal. As we bring this chapter of the story into focus, it becomes clear that what began as a travel restriction has evolved into a mirror, reflecting Africa's unresolved relationship with power, perception, and participation in global decision-making. The standoff between the United States and Sahelian states, such as Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, is not merely about who crosses whose borders. It is about who sets the rules, who is consulted, and whose security concerns are taken seriously. For African citizens, this moment calls for clarity and caution. Travel bans and diplomatic retaliation often hurt ordinary people first. Students seeking education, families reuniting, entrepreneurs building bridges across borders. Citizens must remain engaged, informed, and vocal in demanding that geopolitical disputes do not trample on human opportunity. Mobility, learning, and exchange are not privileges to be casually suspended. They are lifelines in a globalized world. For African leaders, the lesson is more complex and more urgent. Yes, sovereignty must be defended. Reciprocity is a legitimate principle in international relations. No nation should accept permanent double standards or decisions imposed without consultation. But sovereignty must also be functional, not just symbolic. It must translate into better governance, stronger institutions, credible identity systems, and transparent engagement, so that dignity is reinforced by competence, not undermined by isolation. Retaliation alone is not strategy. Long-term leverage comes from unity, consistency, and credibility. This moment also demands continental coordination. Fragmentation weakens Africa's negotiating position. Whether through reformed regional blocs or new frameworks, African states will need collective platforms to engage major powers, not only in moments of crisis, but proactively, before lines harden and doors close. Key messages from this week's story. Travel bans are no longer just administrative tools. They are instruments of geopolitical signaling and pressure. Africa's response is changing from silence to reciprocity, reflecting growing confidence and frustration with unilateral decision-making. The Sahel has become a testing ground for a post-Western, multipolar Africa, but symbolic defiance carries real economic and social risks. Ordinary citizens bear the greatest cost when diplomacy turns punitive. The future lies not in isolation, but in assertive, coordinated engagement grounded in strong institutions and regional unity. As Africa navigates this shifting global landscape, the challenge is not choosing between defiance and compliance, but mastering the art of negotiation from a position of strength. That strength will not come from bans alone. It will come from governance that works, diplomacy that listens, and leadership that remembers that sovereignty is ultimately measured by how well it serves.
Hello again and welcome back to our discussions. Donald Trump travel ban was framed as a security measure, but many African countries saw it as discriminatory. African and Muslim majority countries were affected by reinforcing a long history of unequal treatment in global mobility. For African nations, the ban symbolized something deeper. It symbolized being judged, excluded, and controlled by foreign powers. Therefore, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not acting by accident. They have distanced themselves from the US and French influence. They also emphasize sovereignty and self-determinations. These countries also are rejecting the Western dominance in security and politics. Banning US citizens is their way of saying we make our own decisions now. Let us be clear. This is not about the visas. It's about who controls the borders, who defines acceptable nations, and who gets to punish and who must comply. For decades, the US banned others without any consequences. This time, the response came back. This decision damages the US influence in West Africa. It simplifies diplomatic relations are weakening. Security cooperation suffers, and also Americans' image as a global leader is taking another hint. When countries stop fearing the United States, retaliation loses leverage. This could be a beginning of something new. Most countries may start responding instead of submitting. More governments may challenge Western authority openly. The question is no longer, can Africa respond? The question is, how many others are watching and preparing to do the same? Remember that Trump's travel ban may be old news in America, but in Africa, the consequences are just the beginning. Thanks for watching today's discussions. If you feel that today's conversation needs to be discussed further, then leave your thoughts in the comment section. Until next time, be grounded and stay blessed.